Hi, I'm Ananya, and I'll be presenting our paper, Are LLMs Empathetic to All? Investigating the influence of multi-demographic personas on a model's empathy. Given two users who have the same dilemma, user 1 is a female belonging to the Confucian culture and 18 years old, while user 2 is an 18-year-old male from the English-speaking culture. With the same set of dilemma, that is, after high school, they did not get admission in BE. They go and they felt dash. They go up to the LLM, and the LLM predicts user one's emotion as feeling ashamed, while for the user's two emotion, it feels disappointed. When asked for the LLM to respond, for user one, the LLM focuses mainly on the values and that is displayed by the user one's culture, which is the Confucian culture, while for user two, the LLM takes up a more solution-oriented approach. This brings up to us to the main question of this paper. Is the LLM's capability to show empathy relative across various user personas? Does an LLM's variance in its empathetic abilities align with real-world experiences, or does it show unpatterned biases? Lastly, we also wish to answer and understand which attribute or composition of attributes is reflective of the LLM's neutral state. To do so, we map empathy into two distinct categories. Category 1 that is called affective empathy, and category 2 is cognitive empathy. Affective empathy is the ability of models to understand the emotion expressed in an emotional experience, while cognitive empathy is the ability of the model to conceptualize and respond to the user in an appropriate manner while considering the context of the experience. For the user persona, in this paper, we categorize this user persona as a composition of three categories, primarily culture, gender, and age. Each of these categories is then consists of multiple attributes. Each, for example, a 25 to 34-year-old female from Protestant Europe would be a persona that exists in our data set. In our data set, there exists an additional categories apart from the ones we see, called the base category. This base category defines a condition when, for that particular category, there is no attribute present. So, for example, the 25 to 34-year-old female for Protestant Europe, in the absence of any culture, or in the base category of culture, would be a 25 to 34-year-old female. Having defined a user persona, we now come to defining the metrics of empathy. We have defined for effective empathy, our experiment set up as follows. We take approximately 300 user experiences that we have derived from the ICR dataset. Using approximately 315 combinations of culture, age, and gender, we pass these 94,500 unique interactions to 4 different LLMs and ask each LLM to predict an emotion word. This emotion word is then broken down using the NRC intensity lexicon and an MLP-based classifier into an 8-dimensional vector consisting of intensity scores between 0 and 1 for each of the emotion of anger, anticipation, disgust, fear, joy, sadness, surprise, and trust. We call this I of emotion. For cognitive empathy, we then use a similar setup, but instead of asking the model to predict what the user feels, we ask the model to respond to the user. Using an epitome classifier, we then produce a 3-dimensional vector of ER-IP-EX. Here, ER stands for emotional reaction, IP stands for interpretation, and EX stands for exploration. In emotional reaction, it measures on a scale of 0 to 2 how well the model's response produces or understands the user's emotion. In interpretation, it measures how well it is able to understand the context of the user. And exploration, it measures on a scale of 0 to 2 how well the response is able to provide solutions or explore any options to the user's original query. Through this, given this dimensional score, this vector score, we calculate the effective shift as the difference between the emotions when the attribute is present to the baseline score, and cognitive shift as the epitome score for the attribute to the baseline epitome score. Further, we finally to evaluate the affective and cognitive empathetic shifts. To be able to calculate this difference causally, we use two experiments. Experiment number 1 is isolation of attributes, and experiment number 2 is intersection of the attributes. In isolation of the attributes, the idea is to only provide the attribute and compare it in a case where the attribute is absent or no attributes are present. So for example, for attribute A, that is female belonging to category C, that is gender, we calculate the difference in the cognitive and affective vectors only when female is present versus no persona is present or a base category is present. While for intersection of attributes, while isolation of attributes is a great case because you're able to calculate the difference between, you're able to isolate the attributes, often in real world settings, that's not the case. Often in real world settings, persona is a composition of multiple implicit as well as explicit categories. Hence, we introduce this novel analysis of intersection of attributes, where given an attribute A female, we calculate its baseline approach. We calculate the difference in the cognitive and affective vectors when female is present in presence of other attributes, as well as when female is present in the absence of those attributes. For example, for a 25 to 34-year-old female from Protestant Europe, we calculate the difference from 25 to 34-year-old Protestant Europe with female being absent. We see the results as in isolation of attributes, we map these vectors and see that across different attributes and different categories, there exists a difference in the shift. For example, we see across most models, the Confucian culture has a much higher range of emotions as compared to other cultures within the same category. We also see that 0 to 17 attribute and 55 plus attributes in some cases again have a higher range of emotions compared to 18 to 24 or 18 or 25 to 34, which are much always closer to the zeroth shift line. We see a similar pattern as well as an intersection of attributes, but the one thing that we do notice as a difference between the two is that the values on the y-axis have shrunk comparatively to the isolation of attributes. Coming to the question, is the LLM's capability to show empathy relative across various user personas? We see that affective empathy for Confucian culture is expressed at much lower levels. There is a higher level of anger expressed against genderqueer categories or genderqueer attributes. And while with intersection of attributes, we see most trends do remain same. However, there's a shrinking in the shifts. That is, in presence of other personas, the amount of empathy towards a single attribute reduces in its measurement. However, intersecting analysis do show some deviating trends. For example, we see that models perceive a lesser anger towards females than against males. When we ask the question, does this variance in empathy align with real-world emotional experiences? To study this, we looked up studies from literature, insight studies, as well as Gallup surveys. We see that models only loosely reflect real-world emotional dynamics. In these literature studies, we've seen that younger adults are associated to be more expressive, while older adults are said to be less expressive and more docile. And we do see similar results with people from the age 0 to 17 showing the highest range of emotions. We've also seen that studies show that females have a higher emotional intensity than males, and that's something also that the model reflects. However, this pattern does not follow for different cultures. For example, for African, Islamic, and Confucian culture specifically, the model showed extremely lower levels of anger intensities, when in real world, that's not the case. In real world, follows a very different pattern. We also want to understand which attribute is most reflective, which attribute and which persona is most reflective of the model's internal state. To do so, we map this graph in which the bigger the bubble, the more misaligned that particular attribute is from the model's neutral state when when there is no persona given. We see an attribute like female is most aligned to trust in GPT-4o mini and to disgust in GPT-4o mini, while something like uh, something like 0 to 17 is more aligned in disgust in GPT-4o mini. So across models for each category, the attribute that it is most aligned to varies. Lastly, we want to understand what content difference does the response follow any pattern, or are the responses specific to the particular category that it is expressing for? And we see yes. We calculate the log odds of word usage in these model generated responses using a derivation prior, and we see that specifically for culture, we see the topmost words generated are often are often following or related to the cultural attribute. Similarly, for gender, while for age, most of these attributes or most of these words are generalized. Finally, I present the takeaways. In this paper, we've been able to present a detailed, comprehensive, and novel analysis to measure whether LLMs exhibit equitable empathy across different combinations of user personas. We see that empathetic responses are often dependent on the context that the user provides, and not just dependent upon the context of the sentence experience, but also of the user. And this context is also heavily swayed by social stereotypes that exist in real world. We see that underrepresented groups experience most misalignment, specifically those of Confucian culture, African Islamic, and genderqueer categories. There now exists a pressing need to develop models that show equitable empathy to all. Thank you.